12-team playoff, to say it's flawed is an understatement. I'll start, Joel, with this. Generally speaking, if you have the best regular season Oregon and the best conference championship performance Oregon, your reward shouldn't be potentially Ohio State, Texas, and Georgia. I just look at that and I think, how does Penn State get grooved into their path, and how does Oregon get there? That's my first complaint, that Oregon got a bit hosed. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. Like, can you imagine if the Kansas City Chiefs had to face the hardest road to get to the Super Bowl after getting the 1 seed? Like, we don't do that because that's ridiculous. But in college football, we still do it. There's so much to get into, Colin, that all ties together with this sentiment. So you're just bringing up Oregon. And yes, you can talk about their path and how, if you look at the top 4 teams as far as odd makers go, in terms of winning the national championship, are Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, and Texas. What's the path for Oregon? Those teams, which is asinine, in particular in a sport that desperately wants to retain the value of its regular season. Yes. Because the value of its regular season is unique, and they've totally blown that. Okay, so a bunch of things that I want to get into here, and I'm going to try to do them quickly, Colin. But first and foremost, you have to understand that modern college football and vintage college football are like oil and water. What is old in this sport and what is new in this sport do not mix. It's new wine and old wineskins for those of you biblical scholars out there. Like, it doesn't work. The bowl system and the playoff system doesn't really work together. Mega conferences and 8 conference game schedules don't really mix together. A balanced Power 5 that is given a similar revenue share from the television networks is the old system. Now we've got 2 mega conferences that are getting the lion's share of the television network money. That doesn't really mix when then you're trying to create this equal footing in a playoff. Okay, so that's what's old and what's new. And what's the problem with this is that the people who built this system, this 12-team playoff, are the same people that built the Bowl Alliance. They're the same people that built the BCS. They're the same people that gave us the 4-team playoff, and now they're the same people that gave us the 12-team playoff. And what they've been trying to do is renovate old structures. But what I just told you is absolutely correct. What is old and what is new in this sport do not mix. This needed to be a tear down and not a renovation. And they gave us a renovation with some paint over there and didn't really even remodel the kitchen. Here's why I come to that conclusion, is because the reason that they gave the 4 byes to conference champions is because they were trying to placate self-interest within college football, which is what we do all the time. So the commissioners of the ACC and the Big 12 and all these other conferences are like, we're not going to go along with this renovation unless we have a bye in the first round for our champion. And so the Big 10 and the SEC are like, fine, in order to get the 12-team playoff, we will placate you. So the structure of this system was flawed from the get-go because it was trying to retain the value of the conference championship game, because that value is very high to each one of those conferences in terms of a revenue distribution from the television network. So now you fast forward. So now the flaw is in the construction of this thing. And now the committee is trying to place people inside of a flawed structure. And yet they doubled down on the exact thing that didn't work in the construction of the entire playoff, which was they tried to overvalue conference championship games. So we go back to the exact same point. It's the one little needle that threads all this together. So this committee overvalues the conference championship games, and they put an artificial floor below teams that played in those games: Texas, Penn State, SMU. Once you put an artificial floor there, here's what happens, is that the better resumes and better teams get artificially shoved down the bracket and down the seeding, which then in turn hurts the very team that you were trying to reward in the first place, which was Oregon. So now Oregon is sitting there with a potential second-round game against, let's just call it favored Ohio State. They're favored against Tennessee. Let's say they win. They've got to play Ohio State. And yet, when you look at the resume and the quality of the teams between Ohio State, Notre Dame, Texas, and Penn State, Ohio State's the best resume of all of those. So in the exact manipulation of trying to save conference championship games, you actually ruined them. This is what they don't understand, is that there is a cost to these artificial manipulations of construction. And when you try to do things that are not a meritocracy, this is what you get. And it ends up being an unfair burden on the top, which is Oregon, which had the best regular season of anybody in the sport, had the best conference championship game of anybody in the sport, and now you gave them the toughest path of any of the 4 teams that got a bye.
Yeah.
And they did that because of an artificial floor put on those conference championship games. And that's how we get here.
Okay, let me talk about let's just get to the point. Like, people want to talk about games here, so let's talk about this. Ohio State's at home as a favorite. They're wobbling. Their O-line's a bit of a mess, and Tennessee's defensive front is stout. I look at that game and I'm like, Ohio State, that is the worst team. Penn State played 2 good teams. They lost to both, including one at Happy Valley. Yeah. Ohio State's got some impressive wins. Even their loss at Autzen, that's about as good as you can have. That's about the best loss of the year in college football. I mean, when Texas lost to Georgia at home, that was a bad loss. They got pushed around. Losing in the last play at Autzen to a great team's a great loss. Ohio State, to me, it's going to be lousy weather. That hurts their great wide receiving core. It's going to be 38, cold and wet. I think that's a bad matchup for the Buckeyes, Joel. You've seen a lot of Ohio State. I don't like that game for Ohio State. Do you?
I completely agree with you. If you look at the games in which they struggled, namely on the offensive side, you would point to the Nebraska game and you would point to the Michigan game. And the thing that Nebraska and Michigan had is they were very stout in the interior of their defensive line. That's the whole deal. And a team that was committed to running the football on the opposite side. So, and those 2 teams had terrible offenses, and Ohio State survived against Nebraska with a 4th down goal line stand with their defense and didn't survive against Michigan. So this is not a great matchup for Ohio State, not in the least. What we haven't seen is that Chip Kelly and Ryan Day have not leaned totally into being like, hey, we're going to just go do what we did against Georgia 2 years ago, and we're just going to sling it around and use our talent on the outside. We have not seen them do that. Chip was incredibly stubborn against that's the whole deal. And a team that was committed to running the football on the opposite side. So, and those 2 teams had terrible offenses, and Ohio State survived against Nebraska with a 4th down goal line stand with their defense and didn't survive against Michigan. So this is not a great matchup for Ohio State, not in the least. What we haven't seen is that Chip Kelly and Ryan Day have not leaned totally into being like, hey, we're going to just go do what we did against Georgia 2 years ago, and we're just going to sling it around and use our talent on the outside. We have not seen them do that. Chip was incredibly stubborn against Michigan, and I'm wondering if he's going to open it up against Tennessee. My question is, can you when it's 37 degrees and windy? That's much easier down at the Sugar Bowl or somewhere in Atlanta. Okay, here's the other one. At one point, I've been burned I got to put on SPF 50 when I talk Texas football because I've been burned my whole life by them. I mean, it's insane. 19 penalties, twice against Georgia. I got to be honest. I didn't like the play calling by Texas in overtime, Joel. A fade route out of the end zone. Then you throw it in the flat against the most athletic team in the sport. Those plays aren't going to work. Some of this is it's on Sark a little bit. I didn't like the play calling in overtime. Did you? No, I didn't. And it was the same type of play calling we got late against Washington last year.
Yes.
Right? The fade routes, I just don't like clutch fade routes unless you tell me that you're a great back shoulder fade team and you have the option where you're legitimately going to read it. And if your wide receiver wins on top, then you can throw that down the field throw. Or if he's not going to win and be on top, you can hit it on the back shoulder. Indiana is great at that. So when you go to the one-on-one matchup and you're great at reading the back shoulder, that's one thing. But Quinn Ewers is not very good at that. He throws with touch all the time. He floats the football. And time and time again, they go to these fade routes, and it's got to be maddening for Texas fans. And here's one thing that I'll just say. I'm surprised we haven't seen more arch.
Same.
Ewers' lack of mobility, Colin, is hurting them. And if you don't have mobility, you better be able to throw guys open, and you better be able to manipulate the game from the pocket in a way that gives you an advantage. And when I watch Texas, Ewers' lack of mobility is actually it's a hindrance to the way they call plays because they have to call plays to get guys open for him because he rarely throws guys open, if that makes sense. You're not seeing him drive the football and then layer the football and then throw with touch. He doesn't change pace very often. Whereas with Arch, you might not get as seasoned of a passer. Okay, that's fine. but he does have a stronger arm. He can drive the football in tight spaces, and he's much more athletic. And there are times, in particular against Georgia, when it becomes tough, and you can't just scheme somebody wide open. Texas stalls out, and then they resort to these one-on-one fade throws, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And I will tell you why I'm concerned for Texas, and maybe even Georgia as well. I believe to win this playoff, at some point along the way, you're going to have to do what Oregon just did against Penn State, which is get into a shootout and win. And look across the field and say, no one's going to stop us today.
Right.
We've seen it from the Georgias and the Clemsons and the Alabamas throughout the playoff history. We've seen it from Michigan in order to win the playoff. At some point, you're going to have to go out there and say, you won't stop us in this half of football. And I don't know if either of those teams can do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I said this earlier. These SEC teams, and listen, it's a great conference, but I would argue this year, Ohio State, Penn State, and Oregon are absolutely as good as the top three in the SEC. Oregon's offense is better than anything in the SEC, and I think Penn State's.
Did you see how fast they look Saturday night? Like, just how fast everybody on the outside. It's like Tej Johnson gets the ball, and you're like, whoa.
How about this?
Okay.
Show the bracket again. Think about this. If you ask James Franklin, put the bracket up.